With only one sentence, a 10-year-old girl stopped a $250 million scam in its tracks. In a penthouse high above the city, a billionaire sheikh prepared to sign a deal worth $250 million. His advisors leaned in, dazzled by the promise of history and fortune. The document before him looked like a sacred relic, sealed and scripted in ancient Arabic. But in the corner of the room, almost invisible, stood a 10-year-old girl, Ava, the maid's daughter, clutching her great-grandfather's worn journal. She was never meant to be noticed. Yet, as the sheikh's pen hovered over the contract, Ava saw something no one else did. The kind of mistake only a true historian would catch. And when she finally spoke, in flawless Arabic, the entire room froze. "This is a fake." Her small hands knew the feel of old books, not polished silver. 10-year-old Ava stood quietly in the corner, a ghost in a room of giants. Her mother had told her to be invisible, and she was trying her very best. The penthouse apartment felt like a different world. It hung over the city like a glass castle in the clouds. Below, the streets were a tangle of yellow taxis and hurried lives. Up here, the air was still and smelled of lemon polish and expensive leather. Ava's mother, Helen, moved through the room with a practiced quietness. She refilled glasses with water that came from bottles worth more than their groceries for a week. Her face was a careful mask of polite service, but Ava could see the worry in her eyes. Helen's hands, usually so steady, trembled just a little as she placed a coaster on a marble table. Ava clutched a worn, leather-bound book to her chest. Its pages were filled with the elegant, flowing script of her great-grandfather. It was her only comfort in this place of cold glass and colder stairs. Her own clothes were simple, a plain blue dress, clean but faded from many washes. Her blonde hair was tied back with a simple ribbon. She knew she did not belong here. The other people in the room made sure she knew it, too. They were men in sharp suits that cost more than a car. Their shoes gleamed. Their watches flashed under the recessed lighting. They spoke in low, serious tones about numbers that had too many zeros for Ava to count. Their host was Sheikh Tariq al-Jamil. He was an older man with a trimmed gray beard and eyes that seemed to hold a deep sadness. He sat in a large leather chair, looking out at the city skyline. He had not smiled once. He was surrounded by advisors, but he seemed alone. He was a man who commanded respect, but today, he looked like a man carrying a heavy burden. The reason for the meeting soon walked through the door. His name was Mr. Alistair Finch. He was tall and handsome, with silver hair and a smile that seemed too bright to be real. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and moved like he owned the very air in the room. He greeted the sheik with a deep, confident voice. But when his eyes landed on Helen, and then on Ava, his smile tightened. It became something sharp and unpleasant. "Tariq, my friend," Mr. Finch began, his voice smooth as silk. "I trust the preparations are in order?" He gestured vaguely toward Helen without looking at her. "And the distractions have been minimized?" Helen's back stiffened. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and moved to take Mr. Finch's coat. Ava pressed herself further into the corner, wishing the shadows would swallow her whole. The sheik's gaze flickered toward Ava for a moment. There was no unkindness in his eyes, only a deep weariness. He seemed too tired to correct his guest's rudeness. "Everything is ready, Alistair," the sheik said, his voice a low rumble. "Let us proceed." The men gathered around a massive mahogany table. Helen continued her silent work, pouring coffee, her movements efficient and discreet. Ava watched her mother, her heart aching. Helen had been working 2 jobs since Ava's father passed away. Her hands were chapped and her face was often etched with fatigue. She did it all for Ava, to keep a roof over their head and food on the table. She endured the condescending glances and the dismissive tones of men like Mr. Finch so that Ava could have a chance at a better life. One of the other men at the table, a younger associate of Mr. Finch, snickered. He leaned over to his colleague and whispered, loud enough for Ava to hear, "Can you believe it? Bringing a child to a place like this. Some people have no sense of propriety." His friend nodded, smirking. "Probably couldn't afford a babysitter. It's a shame what they let in the door these days." The words were like tiny, sharp stones. Ava's cheeks burned with shame. She wanted to run, to hide her face in her mother's apron. But she stayed still. She remembered her great-grandfather's words, which she had read in his journal just that morning. "Dignity is a fortress, little star." Do not let the words of small men breach its walls. So she stood taller, her chin held high, her fingers tracing the faded gold letters on her book. The meeting began. Mr. Finch opened his briefcase with a flourish. He spoke of investments, of historical opportunities, of profits that would echo for generations. His voice was mesmerizing. He painted pictures with his words, of desert sands turning to gold, of ancient lands yielding new treasures. The men at the table leaned in, their eyes gleaming with greed. Even the weary sheik seemed to sit up straighter, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Then came the centerpiece of the presentation. Mr. Finch pulled out a long, cylindrical case. He handled it with extreme care, as if it contained a sacred relic. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice dropping to a dramatic hush, "the key to our shared future." He opened the case and, using white gloves, unrolled a long sheet of old, yellowed parchment. It was covered in beautiful, intricate Arabic calligraphy. At the bottom was a heavy wax seal, a deep crimson against the aged document. "The original land deed," Mr. Finch announced, "granted by the ancestors of our esteemed host, Sheikh Tariq. It grants undisputed ownership of the Al-Khor Oasis and all the mineral rights beneath it. An untapped resource worth, conservatively, $250 million. A collective gasp went through the room. The men stared at the document with reverence. The sheik leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the parchment. It was a piece of his family's history, a link to his past, and a promise for his future. Helen was clearing away empty coffee cups from a side table near where Ava was standing. As she passed, one of the investors, a man with a large, flashy ring, waved his hand dismissively. "Be careful, woman. That document is worth more than your entire life." Helen flinched as if she had been struck. She nodded quickly, her face pale, and retreated toward the kitchen. Ava watched her go, a hot fire of anger building in her small chest. She looked back at the table, at the arrogant men, at the smiling Mr. Finch. And then she looked at the document. From across the room, it was just an old piece of paper. But something about it felt wrong. Ava had spent hundreds of hours studying her great-grandfather's books and journals. He had been a historian, a linguist, a man who loved the past. He had taught her to see the stories that objects told. He taught her about paper and ink, about scripts and seals. Her eyes narrowed. The parchment was too perfect, too uniform in its yellowing. Old parchment, true vellum, often had imperfections, thinner spots where the animal hide had been scraped. The ink, even from this distance, seemed too black, too crisp. Ancient iron gall ink faded to a soft brown and often ate into the paper over centuries, leaving a faint halo. This ink just sat on the surface. And the seal. Something about the seal was wrong. The sheik was reaching for a pen. A very expensive, gold-plated pen. The contract was beside the deed, waiting for his signature. Millions of dollars were about to change hands based on that piece of parchment. A knot of dread tightened in Ava's stomach. They were all being fooled. Mr. Finch's smile was that of a predator who had cornered his prey. Helen returned to the room, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She moved toward the table, her steps hesitant. She knew this was the critical moment. Everyone was holding their breath. The only sound was the faint scratch of the sheik's pen nib hovering over the paper. Ava had to do something. But what? She was just a child. The maid's daughter. They had already dismissed her, insulted her, made her feel like nothing. Who would listen to her? She took a small step out from the corner. Then another. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of her mother's tired face. She thought of her great-grandfather's lessons. "Truth has a quiet voice," he had written, "but it is the loudest sound in a room full of lies." She opened her mouth to speak, but only a small squeak came out. No one heard. The sheik's pen touched the paper. In a moment of pure panic, Ava's hand, the one not clutching the book, knocked against a small side table. On it sat a single, empty water glass. It tipped, wobbled for a terrifying second, and then crashed to the marble floor. The sound shattered the tense silence like a gunshot. Every head snapped in her direction. The sheik's pen lifted from the contract. Mr. Finch's face, which had been a mask of triumph, twisted into a snarl of fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice cracking like a whip. He glared at Helen. "Control your child. This is a house of business, not a playground." Helen rushed forward, her face white with fear and mortification. "I'm so sorry, sir." So terribly sorry. Ava, go to the kitchen. Now. The other investors were muttering, shaking their heads in disgust. Unbelievable. The audacity. Get her out of here. Ava looked at her mother's panicked face, at the circle of angry, powerful men. She saw the sheik, his expression unreadable, his hand still poised over the contract. She saw Mr. Finch, his eyes boring into her with pure hatred. She knew she had one chance. One single moment before they threw her out. She took a deep breath. She did not look at her mother. She looked directly at Sheikh Tariq al-Jamil. And then, in a voice that was shockingly clear and steady, she spoke. She did not speak in English. She spoke in the beautiful, formal Arabic her great-grandfather had taught her, the language of scholars and poets. The words hung in the air-conditioned silence of the penthouse. This is a fake. The room went utterly, profoundly still. The investors stared, their mouths agape. They did not understand the words, but they understood the tone. It was a tone of absolute certainty. Mr. Finch's jaw dropped. A flicker of sheer panic flashed in his eyes before he could mask it. Helen froze, her hand halfway to Ava's shoulder. She stared at her daughter as if she were a stranger. She had no idea Ava could speak a word of Arabic. But Sheikh Tariq al-Jamil understood. His head, which had been bowed over the contract, slowly lifted. His dark, weary eyes widened, first in disbelief, and then with a dawning, intense focus. He stared at the small, blonde-haired American girl in the faded blue dress. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The entire $250 million deal hung suspended in the air, held there by the quiet, impossible words of a 10-year-old girl. The sheik slowly put down his pen. He did not look at Mr. Finch. He did not look at his advisors. He looked only at Ava. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice a quiet, dangerous rumble. He spoke in English, but his eyes were demanding a different answer. Mr. Finch finally found his voice. He let out a short, forced laugh that sounded more like a bark. "A trick. A party trick she must have learned. Don't be absurd, Tariq. She's a child. What could she possibly know?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Helen, take your daughter and leave. You are dismissed." Helen reached for Ava's arm, her whole body trembling. "Ava, let's go. Please." This was a disaster. They would be fired. They would be homeless. All because Ava had spoken out of turn. But Ava did not move. She stood her ground, her small shoulders squared. She met the sheik's gaze and spoke again, this time in English, her voice unwavering. "I said it's a fake." She pointed a small, steady finger at the document on the table. "That whole thing is a lie." The confidence in her voice was staggering. It was not the petulance of a child. It was the conviction of an expert. The room was now divided. On one side was Mr. Finch, sputtering with outrage, and his investors, looking confused and annoyed. On the other was the silent, calculating sheik. And in the middle was Ava, a tiny island of defiance. "This is outrageous." Mr. Finch boomed, his face turning red. "Are you going to let a servant's brat scuttle the deal of a lifetime based on a childish fantasy? Tariq, sign the contract. Let's be done with this nonsense." The sheik ignored him. His eyes were still locked on Ava. He saw the worn book she clutched. He saw the lack of fear in her eyes. He saw something that made him pause. In his world of deceit and flattery, raw, unafraid honesty was a rare and precious commodity. "Prove it," the sheik said softly. The two words dropped into the room with the weight of a judge's gavel. Mr. Finch's angry tirade died in his throat. He stared at the sheik in disbelief. "Prove it? You want her to prove it? She's 10 years old. She made an accusation in my home that questions not only your honor, but my intelligence," the sheik replied, his voice growing colder. "She will have the chance to explain herself. Bring the child here." One of the sheik's advisors, a stern-looking man named Kareem, stepped forward. He looked from the sheik to Ava with a conflicted expression. He hesitated, then gave a slight nod. Helen looked like she was about to faint. This was a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Her daughter was about to be humiliated, and they were about to lose everything. Ava, however, walked forward. She didn't run. She didn't hesitate. She walked with a strange, calm purpose, her worn-out shoes making no sound on the plush Persian rug. She stopped at the edge of the massive mahogany table, so small that her chin was barely above its polished surface. The group of powerful men stared down at her. To them, she was an insect, an anomaly. An impossibility. The floor is yours, little one, the sheik said, his voice laced with a heavy irony. Tell us all how you, a child, know more than my team of experts and advisors. Explain this lie. Ava took a breath, the scent of expensive cologne and old paper filling her lungs. She placed her great-grandfather's journal on the edge of the table. Then, she looked at the deed. You don't have to be old to see the truth, she began, her voice small but clear. You just have to know where to look. She pointed to the parchment. Real vellum from that period, from the 17th century, was made from calfskin. It was scraped by hand. It would be uneven. If you held it up to the light, she looked at Kareem, the advisor. You would see thinner patches, maybe even a few small holes from the scraping process. This paper, it's machine-made. It's too perfect. It was probably aged with tea or chemicals to make it look old. Mr. Finch let out another scornful laugh. Preposterous. She's been reading fairy tales. Ava ignored him, her focus absolute. She pointed to the beautiful, flowing script. And the ink, she continued. The ink is wrong. For centuries, they used iron gall ink. When it gets old, it doesn't just fade. The acid in the ink eats into the paper. It creates a browning effect, a burn around the letters. This is modern ink. It's made with carbon. It just sits on top of the paper. There's no corrosion. It's flat. A murmur went through the room. The investors were no longer looking at Ava with just annoyance. A seed of doubt had been planted. Kareem, the advisor, leaned closer to the document, his brow furrowed in concentration. Impressive theories, little girl, Mr. Finch said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Did you learn that in your art class? Ava finally turned her clear blue eyes on him. I learned it from my great-grandfather, she said simply. He was Sergeant Michael Peterson. He fought in the war, not just with a gun. He was part of a special unit. They saved art and old documents. He was a hero. He knew more about history than anyone. She tapped the journal. He wrote it all down. He taught me. The sheik's posture changed. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his skepticism beginning to melt away, replaced by an intense, burning curiosity. But that's not the biggest mistake, Ava said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing them all in. She pointed to the magnificent crimson wax seal at the bottom of the document. The biggest mistake is right there. All eyes moved to the seal. It was ornate, bearing the crest of the Al-Jamil family and a line of Kufic script, an early, angular form of Arabic. What about the seal? Kareem asked, his voice sharp with interest. The script, Ava said. It's beautiful, but it's wrong. The calligrapher used a dot for the letter Fa. In the 17th century, in this region, the Kufic script used for that seal would not have used a dot. They used a small, inverted V shape above the character. The dot wasn't standardized in that form of calligraphy until the late 18th century, almost 100 years after this was supposedly signed. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the silent room. Whoever made this was good, she concluded, her voice soft but devastating. But they made a mistake. They got the date of the dot wrong. Silence. A deep, profound, and terrible silence filled the penthouse. Mr. Finch's face had gone from red to a sickly, pale white. He looked at the document, then at Ava, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. The investors were looking at each other, their greed turning to panic. The sheik sat back in his chair. He stared at the deed on his table, the deed he had been moments away from validating, the foundation of a $250 million deal. And he saw it not as a link to his history, but as a cheap and clever forgery. He had been so blinded by hope, so desperate to reclaim a piece of his heritage, that he had almost been taken for a fool, by a con man, and he had been saved, by a child. He finally turned his gaze to Mr. Finch. The weariness was gone from his eyes. It was replaced by a cold, hard fire. It was the look of a king who had just uncovered a traitor in his court. Kareem, the sheik said, his voice dangerously quiet. Get my spectacles, and a magnifying glass. Then he looked at two of the large, silent bodyguards standing by the door. And ensure Mr. Finch and his associates do not leave the room. I believe we have much to discuss. The air in the penthouse, once thick with greed, was now frozen with tension. Mr. Finch stood as if he'd been turned to stone, his handsome face a mask of disbelief. The blood had drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, gray pallor. His associates, The men who had been so eager to toast their impending fortunes now looked at him with suspicion, their whispers turning from admiration to accusation. They shuffled their feet, avoiding his gaze, their expensive suits suddenly looking like costumes for a play that had gone terribly wrong. Helen remained by the door, her hand covering her mouth. Her fear for her job had been replaced by a dizzying mix of shock and a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time: pride. She looked at her daughter, this small, quiet girl who had just faced down a room of powerful men, and saw not a child, but a legacy. She saw her own grandfather, Michael Peterson, a man who had been gentle and kind but possessed a will of iron and an unshakable devotion to the truth. Helen had thought those days, those stories, were just a part of their family's quiet past. She never imagined they would erupt with such force in a billionaire's penthouse. Kareem, the Sheikh's advisor, returned with a pair of delicate, gold-rimmed reading glasses and a heavy, brass magnifying glass. He placed them on the table before the Sheikh with the reverence of a courtroom clerk presenting evidence. The Sheikh picked up the glasses and settled them on his nose. He took the magnifying glass, its lens catching the light, and leaned over the fraudulent deed. The room was so quiet that the soft scrape of the brass magnifier on the mahogany table sounded like a roar. He examined the parchment first, just as Ava had described. He ran a gloved finger over its surface. His expression remained neutral, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. He moved the glass to the calligraphy, tracing the lines of ink. Then, he spent a long time on the seal, his dark eyes narrowed in intense concentration. Mr. Finch finally broke. "This is absurd," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "A circus? Tarek, you cannot possibly be taking the word of a little girl over a document verified by my experts." The Sheikh did not look up. He continued his examination, his silence more damning than any accusation. "My experts are the best in the world," Finch insisted, his voice growing louder, more desperate. "They have authenticated artifacts for museums, for auction houses. This is an insult to them, an insult to me." One of his partners, a heavy-set man named George, stepped away from him. "Your experts, Alistair," George said, his voice low and cold. "You were the one who sourced the document. You brought it to us. You vouched for its authenticity." The implied accusation hung in the air. The other investors shifted, creating a visible space around Finch, isolating him. The Sheikh finally straightened up. He took off the reading glasses and placed them carefully on the table. He looked at Kareem. "Get Professor Al-Fahim on the line," he commanded. "The head of antiquities at the university. Tell him I require his immediate assistance. Use the secure video link." Kareem nodded and quickly, quietly, left the room. The Sheikh then turned his full attention back to Ava. The hardness in his eyes softened as he looked at her. He saw her standing there, small but unbowed, clutching her great-grandfather's journal like a shield. "You said he was a sergeant," the Sheikh said, his voice now calm, almost conversational. "Sergeant Michael Peterson. Tell me about him." Ava's face lit up. Talking about her great-grandfather was her favorite thing in the world. "He was amazing," she said. "He grew up in a small town, but he loved books more than anything. When the war started, he enlisted, but they found out how much he knew about art and history and languages. So they put him in a special group. The Monuments Men," the Sheikh said, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Ava nodded eagerly. "That's what they called them. He went all over Europe. He found paintings and statues that the bad guys had stolen. He saved them. He said he was a soldier for history. He said saving a piece of the past was like saving a piece of the future." Her words, simple and earnest, resonated in the quiet room. The investors, who had been focused on their potential losses, now looked at the girl with a new curiosity. Helen felt tears welling in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away. After the war, Ava continued, he became a professor. But he never stopped learning. He traveled everywhere. He learned to read so many old languages. He said you couldn't trust a translation. You had to read the words the way the person who wrote them did. "He taught me." She patted the journal. "It's all in here. His notes. His drawings. He showed me how to spot a fake. He said most forgers are clever, but they're also arrogant. They always miss one small thing. One little detail that gives them away." "The date of the dot," the Sheikh murmured, looking back at the seal on the parchment. It was such a tiny detail. So small, so insignificant. A dot. A single, tiny that had just saved him from a $250 million mistake. Mr. Finch watched this exchange, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. He saw his plan, so meticulously crafted, unraveling thread by thread. And all because of a child's story about her dead great-grandfather. The injustice of it was maddening. Touching stories, Finch sneered, attempting to regain some control. But they are just that, stories. We are talking about a legal, binding document. We are talking about business, not bedtime tales from a war that ended 80 years ago. The Sheikh held up a hand, silencing him without a glance. We are talking about truth, Mr. Finch, he said, his voice dangerously soft. It is a concept you seem to be unfamiliar with. At that moment, Kareem re-entered the room. He was followed by another of the Sheikh's men, who rolled in a large television screen. Kareem carried a laptop. Professor Al-Fahim is on the line, Your Excellency, he announced. The screen flickered to life. The face of an elderly, scholarly man with a white beard and kind, intelligent eyes appeared. He was in a library, surrounded by towering shelves of old books. Tariq, my friend, the professor said, his voice warm but professional. It is late. I trust this is a matter of some importance. It is, Omar, the Sheikh replied. He gestured for Kareem to position the laptop's camera over the document. I need your eyes on something. Using the high-resolution camera, Kareem focused on the deed. He slowly panned across the parchment, zoomed in on the script, and then, on the Sheikh's instruction, focused tightly on the crimson seal. On the large screen, the details Ava had described were magnified for everyone to see. The perfect, machine-like texture of the paper, the flat, non-corrosive ink, and the seal. Professor Al-Fahim on the screen leaned closer to his own camera, his brow furrowed. He was silent for a long time, stroking his beard thoughtfully. Well, Omar, the Sheikh prompted. The professor sighed, a soft, weary sound. Tariq, where did you get this? That is a question I will be exploring in great detail very shortly, the Sheikh said, his eyes flicking for a moment to the sweating Alastair Finch. First, tell me what you see. I see a very competent, very ambitious forgery, the professor said plainly. The artist is skilled, I will grant them that. The calligraphy is a beautiful imitation of the Diwani style of the period. But it is an imitation, and a flawed one. Tell me about the flaws, the Sheikh said, his gaze fixed on Mr. Finch. The ink is the most obvious, of course, the professor explained, his voice that of a lecturer. As you know, iron gall ink oxidizes over time, it burns the page. This is a modern pigment ink. But the more amateur mistake is in the seal. He gestured to the screen. Kareem, can you focus on the Kufic inscription at the bottom of the crest? The camera zoomed in. Magnified to the size of a dinner plate, the dot on the letter FA was now glaringly obvious. That dot, Professor Al-Fahim said with a shake of his head. A common mistake for forgers who are not true historical linguists. That particular diacritical mark, the dot or nuka, was not used in the formal Kufic script on seals of your family's region until the late 18th century, likely after the reforms influenced by the Ottoman court. In the 1680s, when this document claims to be from, the character would have been undotted or used an entirely different phonetic marker. It is an anachronism, a small one, but a definitive one, like finding a zipper on a suit of medieval armor. He paused, then added, Whoever made this document, my friend, is a good artist, but a poor historian. This is, without any doubt, a fake. The professor's final words echoed in the room. Fake. The word was a death sentence for the deal. Mr. Finch let out a strange, strangled noise, a sound of utter defeat. The other investors backed away from him, as if he were contagious. One of them was already whispering furiously into his phone, likely to his lawyer. The Sheikh disconnected the video call with a nod to Kareem. He sat for a moment in silence, the enormity of the situation washing over him. The betrayal, the near-catastrophic financial loss, the humiliation he had so narrowly avoided. He looked at the circle of greedy, foolish men he had almost partnered with. He looked at the pale, trembling con man who had orchestrated the entire charade. And then, his gaze fell on Ava. She was standing by the table, her small face serious, her hand resting on her great-grandfather's journal. She hadn't gloated. She hadn't said, I told you so. She had simply stated the truth and then stood by it. A small, unshakable pillar of integrity in a room built on lies. The sheik rose slowly from his chair. He was a tall man, and his presence filled the room. The other men fell silent, watching him. He walked around the table, his steps measured and deliberate. He ignored Alistair Finch. He walked right past the panicked investors. He stopped directly in front of Ava. Helen held her breath. She didn't know what to expect. A dismissal? A thank you? A handful of money to make them go away? The sheik looked down at Ava, his dark eyes searching her face. Then, he did something that stunned everyone in the room. He bowed. It was not a shallow nod of the head. It was a deep, formal bow, a gesture of profound respect from a powerful man to a 10-year-old girl in a faded blue dress. In my life, Sheikh Tariq Al-Jamil said, his voice resonating with a deep, newfound emotion, I have been surrounded by advisors, experts, and men of great wealth. Today, my honor and my fortune were not saved by any of them. They were saved by a little girl with clear eyes and a hero for a great-grandfather. He straightened up and looked at Helen. The polite mask of the employer was gone. He looked at her with genuine gratitude and respect. Your daughter, madam, is an extraordinary person. You must be very proud. Helen could only nod, her throat tight with emotion. The sheik then turned to Kareem. His voice was once again steel. Kareem, please escort Mr. Finch and his colleagues to the library. Provide them with refreshments. And have my security team ensure they do not leave the floor. My lawyers will be here in 20 minutes. Finch opened his mouth to protest, but one look from the sheik silenced him. The game was over. He had lost. Defeated and humiliated, he and his now former partners were led out of the room like prisoners. The air instantly felt cleaner, lighter. The grand penthouse living room was now empty except for the sheik, Ava, and Helen. The fraudulent deed still lay on the table, a testament to the disaster that had been averted. The sheik gestured to the comfortable sofas. Please, he said to Helen and Ava. Sit. You are no longer staff here. You are my honored guests. Hesitantly, Helen and Ava sat on the edge of a cream-colored sofa that probably cost more than their car. The sheik sat opposite them, not in his imposing leather chair, but in a smaller one, drawing himself closer, creating an atmosphere of intimacy. I owe you a debt I can never truly repay, he said, looking at Ava. But I must try. Tell me, what can I do for you? Anything you desire. A gift? A reward? He was thinking of money, of course. A trust fund, a scholarship. He could secure her future, and her mother's, for the rest of their lives. It was the simplest, easiest way to show his gratitude. Ava looked at her mother, then back at the sheik. She thought for a moment. She wasn't thinking about toys or money. She was thinking about something else entirely. Your family is very old, right? She asked. The sheik nodded, intrigued. For many centuries, yes. Do you have a library? Ava asked, her eyes wide with excitement. A real one? With really old books? The question was so unexpected, so pure, that the sheik was momentarily taken aback. Then, a genuine, warm smile spread across his face for the first time that day. It transformed his weary features, making him look younger, happier. Yes, little one, he chuckled. I have a library. A very real one. With some very, very old books. He leaned forward, a conspiratorial twinkle in his eye. Some of them, he whispered, are even older than your great-grandfather's. Ava's gasp of delight was the most honest and valuable thing the sheik had heard all day. It was worth more to him than all the money Alistair Finch had tried to steal. In that moment, he realized that the reward this child wanted wasn't something he could buy, but something he could share. Knowledge. History. The very things her great-grandfather had taught her to cherish. It was a debt of honor that would be paid not with gold, but with the rustle of ancient pages. The sheik led them not to another part of the penthouse, but to a private elevator Ava hadn't noticed before, concealed behind a paneled wall that looked like a seamless part of the decor. The doors opened with a soft hiss, revealing an interior of polished dark wood and soft, golden light. As they descended, a gentle humming replaced the city's distant noise. It felt like they were leaving the modern world behind, sinking into something older and quieter. My apartment is for business, the sheik explained, his voice softer in the confined space. For meetings with men like Alistair Finch. But my home, my library, that is for the soul. The elevator doors opened directly into the most magnificent room Ava had ever seen. It wasn't a room, it was a sanctuary. 2 stories high, walled from floor to ceiling with books. Dark wood shelves overflowed with leather-bound volumes, their spines glinting with gold leaf in the warm, ambient light. A spiral staircase, wrought from dark, ornate iron, curled its way up to a second-floor gallery that wrapped around the entire room. In the center of the space, on a large, intricately woven Persian rug, were several deep leather armchairs and low tables, inviting quiet contemplation. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax, a scent that Ava associated with her great-grandfather's study, a scent that felt like home. Ava stood frozen on the threshold, her blue eyes wide with a wonder that eclipsed everything else she had seen that day. The glass castle of the penthouse had been impressive, but this was magical. This was a treasure chamber far more valuable than the one Mr. Finch had tried to sell. Helen, too, was speechless. She had spent her life cleaning the sterile, impersonal spaces of the wealthy. She had never been invited into the heart of such a place, a room that spoke not of money, but of passion and history. The Sheikh watched Ava, a smile playing on his lips. Her reaction was the purest form of praise the room had ever received. "Go on," he said gently. "It will not bite." Ava took a tentative step forward, her fingers lightly brushing the spine of the nearest book. She tilted her head to read the title, her lips moving silently. She was in the presence of greatness, of thousands of stories and lifetimes of knowledge, and she treated it with the reverence of a true believer. "This is more than I ever imagined," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "My father started the collection," the Sheikh said, walking slowly into the room. "And his father before him. I have added to it over the years. It is my one true indulgence." He gestured to a large, glass-topped display case in the center of the room. "Some of the older pieces are here." Ava and Helen followed him. Inside the case, resting on dark velvet, were ancient artifacts. A clay tablet covered in cuneiform script, a fragment of an Egyptian scroll from the Book of the Dead, and several beautifully illuminated manuscripts from the Islamic Golden Age. Ava stared at a Quran from the 10th century, its pages decorated with intricate gold leaf and lapis lazuli. The calligraphy was breathtaking. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "That is the work of a true artist," the Sheikh said, his voice layered with meaning. "Someone who understood the history, who respected the materials. Not a charlatan looking for a quick profit." The shadow of Mr. Finch's betrayal still lingered, but here, in this room, it seemed to lose its power, diminished by the weight of genuine history. He turned to Helen. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, using her name with a respect that was entirely new. "Your daughter has a remarkable gift. A gift inherited, it seems, from a remarkable man." Helen found her voice, though it was thick with emotion. "My grandfather, he was just a quiet man. He loved his books. I never thought." Her words trailed off. She looked at Ava, who was now tracing the lines of the cuneiform tablet with her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. How had she failed to see the depth of the legacy he had passed on to her daughter? "Quiet men are often the ones who change the world," the Sheikh replied. "They do not make noise. They simply do the work that matters." He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "I meant what I said upstairs. I owe you a debt, and I do not like being in debt." He walked over to a small, elegant desk in the corner of the library and picked up a checkbook. It was the solution of a billionaire, a simple transaction. Helen's stomach tightened. She appreciated the gesture. She truly did. The money would change their lives. It would mean an end to the constant worry, the second job, the fear of falling behind. But somehow, it felt inadequate. It felt like a payment for a service rendered, and what Ava had done was so much more than that. Before the Sheikh could write, Ava spoke, her voice pulling their attention back to the display case. "This one isn't real." Her statement, so similar to the one that had shattered the deal upstairs, hung in the quiet air of the library. The Sheikh froze, his pen hovering over the check. Helen's heart leaped into her throat. "Oh, Ava, no. Not now. Don't push your luck." The Sheikh slowly put the checkbook down and walked back to the display case. His face was unreadable. "What did you say?" Ava pointed to a small, simple-looking dagger with a jeweled hilt, lying next to a collection of ancient coins. "That one," she said. "The dagger. It's not from the same time as the coins." The Sheikh stared at the dagger. It had been in his family for generations, supposedly a relic from a distant ancestor, a warrior poet of the 12th century. It was one of his most prized possessions. That dagger has been in my family for 300 years, he said, his voice flat. It was authenticated by the British Museum in 1958. Ava did not flinch. They were wrong, she said, with the same simple certainty as before. She looked up at him, her expression not arrogant, but helpful. It's the metalwork on the hilt. The filigree. That style wasn't used in that region until much later, probably during the Ottoman period. It looks older because the blade is old. The blade is real 12th century. But someone probably found the blade and added the fancy handle in the 16th or 17th century to make it look more valuable. She looked down at her great-grandfather's journal, which she had placed on the edge of the case. She seemed to be gathering her courage. My great-grandfather wrote about this kind of thing. He called them marriages. When someone takes two old things and puts them together to make one new, fake thing. It's harder to spot than a complete forgery, because parts of it are real. The sheik stared at the dagger, an object he had cherished, a story he had believed his entire life. He had shown it to scholars, to historians, to collectors. No one had ever questioned it. Now, this 10-year-old girl was dissecting it with the casual precision of a master surgeon. He felt a sudden, sharp pang, not of anger, but of something else, a sense of being unmoored. How much of what he thought was real was actually a carefully constructed story? Finch's deed was a lie. Was this dagger a lie too? Instead of becoming angry, he felt a strange sense of liberation. Ava wasn't just exposing fakes, she was revealing the truth. And the truth, he was beginning to understand, was more valuable than any artifact, any story, any amount of money. He let out a long, slow breath and then, to Helen's utter astonishment, he began to laugh. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a deep, hearty laugh that echoed through the vast library, a sound of genuine, unburdened amusement. In one afternoon, he said, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye, you have cost me $250 million in a fraudulent deal, and you have shattered one of my most cherished family myths. You, little girl, are the most expensive and most valuable guest I have ever had. He looked from Ava's serious face to Helen's terrified one, and his laughter softened into a warm smile. Do not worry, Mrs. Peterson. Your daughter is not in trouble. She is the revelation. He turned back to his desk, but he did not pick up the checkbook. He pushed it aside. The idea of simply giving them money now seemed crass, almost insulting. It was what Alistair Finch would have done. It was the language of transactions, not of gratitude. Ava deserved more. Her gift deserved more. I have a proposition for you, he said, his tone shifting from amusement to serious purpose. For both of you. He looked at Helen. I would like to offer you a position. Not as a maid. I need a curator for this collection. Someone to manage it, to research it, to care for it. But I don't want a traditional academic from a university. I want someone with integrity. Someone who understands the value of truth. He paused. I believe that person is you. You raised this remarkable child. You carry the legacy of Sergeant Michael Peterson. I would pay you a generous salary. And I would provide you with a home, here in the building. Helen was so stunned she couldn't speak. A curator. A home. It was a world away from scrubbing floors and worrying about rent. It was a life she had never dared to dream of. Then, the sheik turned to Ava. And for you, young lady, my offer is different. I do not want to give you a reward. I want to give you a responsibility. He swept his arm, encompassing the entire library. This will be your classroom and your playground. I want you to study every book, every artifact in this collection. I want you to find the marriages. I want you to find the fakes. I want you to help me separate the truth from the lies. His eyes gleamed with a new project, a new passion. We will build a new collection, one based not on sentiment and story, but on verifiable truth. We will create a foundation in your great-grandfather's name, the Sergeant Michael Peterson Foundation for Historical Integrity. It will fund research. It will expose forgeries. It will teach others how to see the world with your eyes. He leaned forward, his voice filled with an earnest, compelling energy. I will give you all the resources you need. Tutors, access to experts, travel when you are older. In return, you will be my secret weapon, my personal truth detector. What do you say? Ava was speechless. To be let loose in this library, to be given the job of solving its mysteries, was the greatest adventure she could possibly imagine. It wasn't a gift of money that would be spent and gone. It was a gift of purpose. She looked at her mother. Helen's face was a canvas of disbelief and dawning joy. The worry lines that seemed permanently etched around her eyes were gone, replaced by the sheen of unshed tears of happiness. She nodded at Ava, a silent permission, a shared understanding that their lives had just been irrevocably changed. Ava turned back to the sheik. She didn't jump up and down or squeal with delight. She simply stood a little taller, a solemn look on her young face. She held out her hand, not like a child, but like an equal partner sealing a deal. "Okay," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It's a deal, but I have one condition." The sheik, amused and intrigued, took her small hand in his. "Name it. I want to start," Ava said, her eyes flashing toward the display case. "With that dagger." The sheik's smile was wide and genuine. In the heart of his quiet library, surrounded by the ghosts of history, he had lost $250 million and a treasured family myth. But he had found something infinitely more precious. He had found the truth, and it had come in the form of a 10-year-old girl with blonde hair, a faded blue dress, and a hero for a great-grandfather. The real story, he knew, was only just beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change for Ava and Helen. They moved out of their small, cramped apartment with its noisy plumbing and view of a brick wall. Their new home was a spacious, light-filled residence on a lower floor of the sheik's building. It had comfortable furniture, a modern kitchen, and, most importantly for Ava, a whole wall of empty bookshelves waiting to be filled. For the first time in years, Helen didn't have to rush off to a second job cleaning offices late at night. She could make dinner for Ava, help her with her schoolwork, and sit with her in the evenings, just talking. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had been her companion for so long began to recede, replaced by a quiet sense of peace and security. Helen began her new role as curator with a diligence and passion that surprised even herself. The sheik provided her with resources, connecting her with experts from museums and universities. She started with the dagger, arranging for it to be sent to a specialist in historical metallurgy. The report came back a few weeks later, confirming Ava's astonishing diagnosis: a genuine 12th-century blade of Damascus steel, expertly fitted with a 16th-century Ottoman-style hilt. A beautiful, valuable object in its own right, but a marriage, just as Ava had said. It was the first official discovery for the collection, the first truth reclaimed from a lie. Helen found that the skills she'd learned as a maid, attention to detail, meticulous organization, a quiet and observant nature, were perfectly suited to the world of curatorship. She cataloged every book, every artifact, her handwriting neat and precise in the new ledgers. She was no longer invisible. She was a guardian of history, a partner in the sheik's new and vital mission. Meanwhile, Ava's life transformed into a grand adventure. After her regular school day, she would take the private elevator down to the library, which she now called the Vault of Truth. The sheik had tutors waiting for her, a gentle, elderly woman who taught her Latin and ancient Greek, and a young, enthusiastic postgraduate student who showed her how to use carbon dating technology and X-ray fluorescence to analyze artifacts. But her greatest teacher remained Sheikh Tariq himself. He would join her in the library in the late afternoons. Together, they would pore over ancient maps and dusty manuscripts. He treated her not as a child, but as a colleague. He would listen intently as she pointed out the inconsistencies in a 19th-century map of the Arabian Peninsula or questioned the provenance of a Roman coin. She was relentless, her curiosity a bright, burning light that illuminated the darkest corners of the collection. She found a handful of other forgeries, a supposedly ancient Chinese vase that turned out to be a clever 20th-century reproduction, and a series of letters from a famous explorer that were exposed by the modern chemical signature in the paper's watermark. With each discovery, the bond between the old man and the young girl deepened. He found in her a joy and honesty that had been missing from his life, a world away from the sycophants and businessmen who usually surrounded him. She found in him a mentor who valued her mind and nurtured her unique gift. He told her stories of his childhood in the desert, of the stars so bright they looked like spilled diamonds on black velvet. She told him stories from her great-grandfather's journal, of a young soldier's awe at seeing the great art of Europe for the first time. They were an unlikely pair, the billionaire Sheikh and the maid's daughter, united by a shared love for the past and a fierce devotion to the truth. The world outside the vault of truth, however, was not so quiet. The story of Alastair Finch's spectacular downfall became the stuff of legend in the financial world. Stripped of his credibility and facing a barrage of lawsuits from the Sheikh and the other investors he had duped, his empire crumbled. The investigation revealed a pattern of sophisticated fraud stretching back years. He had used his charm and reputation to sell a series of forgeries to wealthy collectors, the land deed being his most audacious attempt. The news reports painted him as a master con man, a wolf in a bespoke suit. But for the Sheikh, the victory felt hollow. He hadn't just been deceived. He'd been willing to be deceived, blinded by his own vanity and a desire to reclaim a piece of a glorious past. Ava hadn't just saved his money. She had saved him from himself. A few months after the incident in the penthouse, the Sheikh held a small, private reception in the library. He didn't invite businessmen or politicians. He invited academics, museum directors, and a few honest art collectors. Helen stood beside him, no longer an employee but a respected colleague. Ava was there, too, in a new blue dress, looking more comfortable in the grand library than she ever had in the sterile penthouse. The Sheikh stood before his guests and officially announced the creation of the Sergeant Michael Peterson Foundation for Historical Integrity. For too long, we have allowed history to be a commodity, he said, his voice resonating with passion. Bought and sold by men who value profit over truth. We celebrate the stories that make us feel important, and we ignore the facts that challenge us. But history is not a storybook. It is a science. It is a discipline, and its bedrock must be truth. He spoke of Sergeant Peterson, a man he had never met, but whose legacy now shaped his own. He spoke of the quiet heroes, the scholars and preservationists who did the slow, patient work of uncovering the past, not for fame or fortune, but because they believed it mattered. And then he introduced the Foundation's first fellow, its guiding star. He called Ava to his side. She stood before the small crowd, not intimidated, but filled with a quiet confidence. She held up her great-grandfather's journal. "My great-grandfather taught me that every object tells a story," she said, her young voice clear and true. "But some stories are lies." He said our job is to listen carefully enough to know the difference. Looking out at the faces of the guests, she saw not judgment or condescension, but respect. She was no longer the invisible girl in the corner. She had a voice, and people were finally listening. The story ends there, but it also begins there. It begins in a quiet library where an old man and a young girl learn to read the past together. It begins with a mother finding a new life, a new purpose, her hands now preserving history instead of just cleaning up after it. It is a story about the lies we tell ourselves and the truths that set us free. You've been there, haven't you? You've felt small in a big room. You've had a truth burning inside you, a piece of knowledge you knew was right, while the world around you insisted it was wrong. You've seen people value shiny, expensive lies over simple, unadorned facts. You've felt the frustration of not being heard, of being judged not for who you are, but for what you appear to be. Ava's story is a reminder that the most powerful voice doesn't have to be the loudest. It just has to be the truest. It's about having the courage to speak that truth, even when your voice shakes, even when you're facing down giants. It's a story that proves that integrity is not a matter of age, or wealth, or status. It is a choice. It is a fortress, and its walls can never be breached by the whispers of small men or the grand deception of a $250 million scam. You weren't wrong to believe in what you knew. The truth was always there. You just needed to wait for the world to be quiet enough to hear it. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. Thanks for spending this time with me.